Iowa Brainwriters Club happily presents the book Fly High, Fly Low by Don Freeman. Fly High, Fly Low by Don Freeman. In the beautiful city of San Francisco, a city famous for its fogs and flowers, cable cars, and towers. There once stood an electric light sign on top of a tall building. And inside the letter B of this sign, there lived a pigeon. Before choosing to make his home here, this proud gray pigeon had tried living in many other letters in the alphabet. Just why he liked the lower loop of the letter B, no one yet knew. During the day, the wide sidewalls kept the wind away. And at night, the bright lights kept him warm and cozy. The pigeons, who roosted along the ledges of the building across the street, thought he was a pretty persnickety pigeon to live where he did.
He's too choosy. He's too choosy.
They would coo. The only one who never made fun of him was a white-feathered dove. She felt sure he must have a good reason for wanting to live in that letter. Every morning, as soon as the sun came up, these two met in the midair, and together they swerved and swooped down into Union Square Park, where they pecked up their breakfast. Mr. Hai Lee was certain to be there, throwing out crumbs from his large paper sack. He would always greet them by saying,
"Good morning, Sid and Midge. How are my two early birds?"
All the birds in the city regarded Mr. Hai Lee as their best friend, and he had nicknames for many of them. Sometimes he brought them hard breadcrumbs, and sometimes, as an extra special treat, day-old cake crumbs from a nearby bakery. After every crumb was pecked up, the pigeons always circled around Mr. Hai Lee's head, flapping their wings as they flew, which was their way of saying, "Thank you." By noontime, Sid and Midge could be seen sailing high in the sky, flying into one cloud and out the other. Side by side, they glided over the bay, until they could look down and see the Golden Gate Bridge. Sid would swoop and fly through the open arches just to show Midge what a good looper he was. Then, as the setting sun began painting the sky with a rosy glow, two tuckered-out birds would slowly be winging their way back to the park, just in time for supper. One evening, after an especially gay lark in the sky, Sid invited Midge to stay and share his letter B with him. Across the way, pigeons were soon bobbing their heads up and down and cooing.
Whoever heard of birds building a nest in the sun? It'll never do. It'll never do.
But Sid and Midge went right on building their nest, as best they could. They used patches of cloth and strands of string and bits of straw, and gradually they grew a strong nest with a perfect view. Then, one misty morning, a few weeks later, just as everything was going along smoothly, something happened, which was very upsetting. It occurred right after Sid had flown down to the park to pick up his breakfast. As usual, he had left Midge, taking her turn sitting on the nest, where there were now 2 eggs to be kept warm. Suddenly, like a bolt out of the blue, Midge felt their perch give a terrible lurch. The buildings across the way seemed to sway back and forth.
"It's an earthquake!"
Screeched Midge. But no, it was even worse than an earthquake. Their sign was being taken down. One by one, the letters were being lowered into a waiting truck below. Midge followed, flapping her wings wildly at the movers, trying to let them know they must not take her nest away. But the men paid no attention to her until the tallest man stopped and shouted,
"Hold everything! Look here, what I found. 2 eggs in the nest. No wonder that pigeon has been making such a fuss."
"Well, what do you know?"
exclaimed another man as he took a peek inside.
"We'll sure have to take good care of this letter. Come to think of it, I know of a bakery shop. That could use a big letter B. Anyway, we won't be throwing this one away. Come on, men, let's get going.
Down the hill they went and far out of sight, with Midge clinging on with all her might. You can imagine how Sid felt when he landed back on the cold and empty scaffold later that morning. He stood there, dazed and bewildered, wondering where his sign had gone. Where was his Midge? And where was their nest with those 2 precious eggs? He looked around on all sides, but not a trace of his sign did he see, when suddenly, off he flew. First to the waterfront. Possibly the sign was being loaded onto a boat. Sid was sure that wherever that particular letter B was, there too, Midge would be. He looked high, and he looked low, but not a sign of his letter did he spy. Next, he flew to the uppermost of the post of the Golden Gate Bridge. He thought perhaps Midge might have passed by that way, but no, not a feather did he find. While he stood wondering where to search next, an enormous fog bank came rolling in from off the ocean. Like a rampaging flock of sheep, the fog came surging straight towards him. When Sid saw this, he puffed out his chest and stretched his wings and whined and cried,
Who's afraid of a little breeze? I'll flop my wings and blow the wind away.
But the fog rolled silently on, and before Sid knew what had happened, he was completely surrounded by a dense, damp grayness. And the faster he flew, the thicker the fog grew, until he could barely see beyond his beak. Down, down, he dived, hoping to land on solid ground. All at once, he found himself standing on top of a traffic light signal, right in the busiest part of town. Once inside the green go signal, Sid began fluffing up his wings, trying to drive them off, before going on with his search for Midge. What Sid didn't know was that his fluffed up wings hid the word go, and no one in the street dared to budge. Soon there was a roar of automobile horns.
People certainly get awfully upset over a little fog,
said Sid as he stuck out his head. Just then, along came a policeman, and when he blew his whistle, beep, beep, Sid flew out like a streak of lightning. At last, the traffic could move on. By now, the fog had changed into rain, and everybody started hopping aboard the cable cars, which is what people do in San Francisco, wherever the hills are too steep or the weather is too wet. And that's exactly what Sid did. Under the big bell on top of the cable car, he found a perfect umbrella. If only the conductor hadn't shouted, "Hold on tight!" Short corner ahead, and then clanged the bell. The clapper of the bell hit Sid so hard that he flew overboard. In the street gutter below, all bruised and weary, he hobbled along, muttering to himself,
People! It's all people's fault!
But then he began to think of the kind man in the park. Would Mr. Haley be there on such a terrible day? How terrible day is this? Sid tried to spread his wings and fly, but he was too weak. He would have to walk all the way to Union Square. Fortunately, the park was only a couple of blocks away, and just as Sid hopped up into the curb, he felt a gentle hand reach down and picked him up. The next thing Sid knew, he was inside Mr. Hale's warm overcoat pocket, where, much to his surprise, he found several sunflower seeds. Right away, he began to feel better. He could hardly wait to get on with his search for Midge. When he peeped out, he saw that the rain had stopped, and warm rays from the sun were beginning to shine down. Mr. Haley talked to his friend inside his pocket as he walked along. Around the corner from here, I know of a bakery where we can get something more for you to eat," he said. As they neared the shop, Mr. Haley noticed some men putting a large letter in the sign above the doorway.
Well, look at that. A new letter, B.
Out popped Sid's head farther. What was that he heard? It sounded exactly like a certain bird he knew cooing. Could it be? Yes, indeed. It was his very own Midge. She had stayed with her nest through thick and thin. Up flew Sid like an arrow shot from a bow. And oh, what a meeting! Such billing and cooing as you've never heard. And no wonder, for their 2 eggs were just about to hatch. Out came 2 tiny beaks breaking through their shells. And out of the bakery shop came the baker and his customers. They all wanted to know what the excitement was about. Sid knew that his first duty was to find some food for Midge. So down he flew, and there was Mr. Haley already holding out his hand full of cake crumbs. After taking the crumbs to Midge, Sid hurried right back down, and this time he circled around and around, Mr. Haley's head flapping his wings happily. And we know what he meant by that. Sometime later, when their old neighbors came flying by, they saw Sid and Midge peacefully perched in the lower loop of the letter B, and the 2 little ones in the upper loop. Oh, those lucky birds! They cooed as they flew away. So, Sid certainly did know what he was doing when he chose that letter, B. The end. Thank you for listening to our Read Aloud. Stay tuned for more exciting stories. We'll see you next time.